Hello, my name is Ripley Atkinson. I'm the Australian Meats and Livestock Manager for StoneX, based in Sydney, Australia, where we're developing price risk management tools for the Australian livestock industry to help the sector manage market and price volatility through our Australian feeder cattle swap. This week, we're going to jump in and examine 2025's record breaking year for Australian beef exports, and particularly how the Australian beef industry and its export processors managed to deal with record volumes of product in the face of such uncertainty in relation to the Trump administration's Liberation Day tariffs, and how we exported record volumes around the world and record volumes to a major market of ours, the United States. To close out, though, I look forwards and consider how the Australian beef industry is going to, and the landscape really for exports is going to look in 2026, particularly into the United States, with this renewed intense competition we're beginning to see and are already seeing in 3 weeks of trading from Brazil. But I'll start with the overall result. And at a high level, beef exports collectively across all countries hit record levels in 2025 for Australia. We shipped 1.54 million metric tonnes. That was growth year on year of about 15% or 201,000 metric tonnes. So the previous records were set in 2024, and we broke that record by 15% or 200,000 metric tonnes. So really significant increase here in volume that we're seeing, and really strong performance. If you look over a little bit of the longer term, from when Australia reached our lows in export volumes, that was set in 2022. In 3 years, beef exports collectively at a total level have increased 82% or nearly 700,000 metric tonnes. So it gives you a good idea of the substantial growth we've seen in cattle supply in Australia, and obviously then how that's translating to the amount of product we're shipping overseas. At a collective level, so not just beef, but also mutton, lamb, goat, and beef collectively, we broke our overall red meat export record, which was set in 2024. So a really strong result overall. If we look at a little bit of the detail and the specifics on the breakdown between grass and grain fed. Now, grain fed beef denominates cattle that have been fed in confinement or pens for a small period of their lives, 60 days at a minimum. Grain-fed exports accounted for 29%, and grass-fed, where animals spend the entirety of their lives on grass, that accounted for 71%. So relatively stable results there. There's not a lot of significant change in the overall share between the two categories, but what I probably want to highlight is the really strong results we've seen in grain-fed exports. So in 2025, Australia shipped 449,000 tonnes of grain-fed beef overseas. That broke the 2024 record by 20% or 74,000 metric tonnes. So really substantial increase in grain-fed exports there. But when we compare that to grass-fed, which is obviously the majority of what Australia produces and subsequently exports, results weren't as significant. Grass-fed exports only lifted by 13%, but in actual volume terms shipped, they lifted by 128,000 tonnes. Focusing on the United States now. In 2025, exports hit a new record, 452,000 metric tonnes we shipped to the US, and that surpassed 2015's record. Year on year, we saw growth of 15% or nearly 60,000 metric tonnes, so a really strong performance. We've got to remember in the second half of 2025, under the Trump administration's tariff agenda, Brazil was hit with 76.4% tariff rate to import beef into the US. What that effectively did is shut Brazil out of the US market in the second half of the year, or for 50% of the year. And what we saw as a result of that was really strong, sustained demand month on month from the US for Australian product. On average, either side of 40,000 metric tonnes for the second half of 2025 was shipped to the United States, and it shows really consistent, strong demand for Australian product. Now, if we look at the United States overall as a share of the total exports that Australia shipped in 2025 for beef, US accounted for 29%. So it was our largest market overall, and obviously a major contributor to the performance in 2025 due to that sustained demand. But I think it's important to recognize that the Trump administration's tariff agenda in the second half of the year had a major influence on Brazil's capacity to export to that market. But now when we look forwards and consider the future, the export landscape and obviously the situation with the reduction of tariffs overall for beef imports into the US means the landscape and the outlook has changed significantly. The underlying fundamentals, though, of lower available domestic US beef production is going to remain, and that's underpinned by the fact that the United States cattle herd has gone through 5 to 6 years of sustained herd liquidation, and obviously in turn, over time, that means a reduced availability of domestic product, which is why the United States is importing so much beef at the minute. When you look at the underlying data, overall US cattle slaughter was its lowest level in 10 years. So it gives you an idea of the lack of available product at the minute, despite the fact that the US is increasing carcass weights and beef production. The cattle supply coming through is much lower, or the lowest it's been in some time. But when we consider now the situation with Brazil, whereby they're only paying a tariff rate of 26.4%, because they're recognized as an other country. So that out of quota tariff rate of 26.4% now applies after Brazil basically filled that quota within the space of 10 days in January of this year. That even though that they're applying a 26.4% to Brazilian imports, that still allows them to remain highly competitive, or the Brazilians remain highly competitive, exporting beef into the US market. What does this mean for Australia and our export sector? That means significantly more competition within the US. And we've already started to see that in early trading, or the first 3 weeks of trading this year, whereby the benchmark indicator for prices into America for manufacturing beef, 90 CL or chemically lean beef, those prices have eased 20 to 25 cents a pound since their highs or records set in mid-November of last year. So this additional volume from Brazil has created additional tension and competition, and because Brazil can produce product and offer it at a lower price, it's forced downward pressure on Australian export prices into the American market. The big question, though, is when the US begins to run out of its own domestic grain-fed product, will they look to Australia to fill that void? We produce a similar quality and similar article of grain-fed beef to America, and if we're looked to and called upon to supply that shortfall because the US domestic production system can't supply the grain-fed product they need, that creates a really exciting prospect for Australia to potentially consider. Now, whether that happens or not, we're unsure, and the timing of that is to be determined, but that is a consideration which leaves Australia in a very formidable position because we'll be recognised as one of the only suppliers in the world of the type of grain-fed product America's looking for. There's lots happening with this situation at the minute. It's constantly evolving and quite fluid, but there will be a lot of eyes on how Australia performs in this year in basically one of the world's most lucrative markets for beef, and also one of our major markets in terms of overall export volumes. That's all from me for this week. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to hear more content like this or similar domestic Australian market information about the beef industry, please head to Apple or Spotify and search for the Australian Cattle and Beef Market Report. This is our fortnightly podcast released on a Friday. Every fortnight on Friday morning, Australian time, I discuss supply, prices, demand, beef exports, and other factors which influence the Australian beef industry. And if you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe to this bit of content and review the episode and or the podcast. We appreciate the support. But until next time, take care. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you then. Cheers.